In the heart of Richmond, Virginia in 1839, where magnolia trees perfumed the air with sweetness that couldn't quite mask the underlying decay, where Greek Revival mansions lined cobblestone streets and represented the pinnacle of Southern refinement, where men spoke of honor and virtue while building fortunes on the backs of human chattel. There stood a house on Marshall Street that embodied everything contradictory and terrible about antebellum Southern society, the Mercer Mansion. 3 stories of white columns and imported marble, brass fixtures that gleamed in candlelight, and Persian rugs that muffled footsteps, was home to Judge Nathaniel Mercer, his wife Catherine, and a secret so profoundly disturbing that when it finally emerged into public knowledge in 1853, it would destroy families, end careers, and raise questions about the nature of power, consent, and the particular madness that can flourish when men of authority believe themselves beyond all moral constraints. Nathaniel Mercer was 43 years old in 1839, a man of impressive bearing, tall and lean with iron-gray hair despite his relative youth, a face that students of physiognomy might describe as handsome in a severe way, all sharp angles and penetrating eyes that seemed capable of detecting lies through pure intensity of observation. He had served as a circuit court judge for 7 years, appointed to the position through connections to Virginia's old money families and his own reputation for brilliant legal reasoning and absolute moral rectitude. Judge Mercer was known throughout Richmond as a harsh but fair jurist, a man who would sentence criminals to maximum punishment without hesitation, but who also insisted on proper procedure and evidence, who had freed several slaves when their masters couldn't prove legal ownership, though he owned 17 enslaved people himself and saw no contradiction in this. He was, in the parlance of the time, a pillar of society, the sort of man whose opinion carried weight in political discussions, whose presence at social events lent them prestige, whose approval young lawyers sought, and whose disapproval could end careers before they properly began. Catherine Mercer, née Harrison, was 28 years old in 1839. The daughter of a tobacco plantation owner from the James River Valley, educated at a female academy in Charleston where she'd learned French, needlework, pianoforte, and the art of managing a household with enslaved labor. She had married Nathaniel when she was 17 and he was 30, an arrangement brokered by their respective families that combined the Mercer legal legacy with Harrison agricultural wealth. For the first 4 years of their marriage, Catherine had given birth to 2 daughters, Margaret in 1829 and Elizabeth in 1831, both healthy children who were being raised primarily by enslaved nurses, while Catherine focused on her duties as a judge's wife, hosting dinners for Richmond's elite, attending church faithfully, maintaining the social calendar that was essential to her husband's career advancement. By all external measures, the Mercers represented the ideal of Southern aristocratic marriage. 2 people of appropriate background and social standing fulfilling their respective roles in maintaining the complex web of status, property, and performance that constituted high society in antebellum Virginia. The factor that would transform this superficially perfect arrangement into something monstrous was introduced in January of 1839, when Nathaniel hired a new clerk for his legal work. William Sterling was 19 years old, the 3rd son of a minor planter family from Henrico County. Intelligent but without prospects, since family property and resources would go to his older brothers according to primogeniture customs. He had studied law informally, reading in an established lawyer's office, as was common practice before formal law schools became standard, and had demonstrated enough aptitude that Nathaniel offered him a position as clerk, a role that combined copying legal documents, conducting research, managing files, and essentially serving as the judge's personal assistant in all matters related to his legal work. William was a handsome young man, golden-haired and blue-eyed, in a way that would later be described by witnesses as almost feminine, with a slight build and delicate features that made him look younger than his 19 years. He moved into a room on the 3rd floor of the Mercer Mansion, part of his compensation being room and board in addition to a small salary, and began his duties with the earnest dedication of a young man determined to prove himself worthy of the opportunity he'd been given. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if this is your first time on our channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that official history preferred to forget. For the first 3 months of William's employment, nothing unusual occurred beyond the normal adjustment of a household incorporating a new member. William performed his duties competently, spending long hours in Nathaniel's study copying case law and preparing briefs, taking meals with the family in the formal dining room where conversation was limited to appropriate topics, church on Sundays where he sat in the Mercer family pew, and occasional social events where he served as something between family member and servant, not quite one or the other but occupying a liminal space that was typical for young men in his position. Catherine treated him with polite distance appropriate to her station, and William responded with the deference expected from someone of his lesser status, and if either felt anything beyond these surface courtesies, they gave no outward sign that would have been noticed by the household's enslaved staff or the various visitors who passed through the Mercer home. The change, when it came, was initiated by Nathaniel himself in a conversation that William would later describe in testimony given under circumstances so unusual that the resulting transcript was sealed by court order and remained hidden in Virginia State Archives until 1983, when researchers studying antebellum social history discovered it by accident. According to William's account, given 14 years after the fact and therefore subject to the distortions of memory and trauma, Nathaniel called him into the study one evening in April 1839. After Catherine had retired for the night, and the house was quiet except for the sounds of enslaved servants completing their final duties before being dismissed to their quarters, Nathaniel poured 2 glasses of brandy, unusual because while he drank wine with meals, spirits were typically reserved for entertaining guests, and invited William to sit, not in the straight-backed chair William usually occupied while taking dictation, but in one of the leather armchairs reserved for visitors of equal status. The judge spoke for nearly 2 hours, and what he said, according to William's later testimony, was so strange and disturbing that the young clerk initially thought his employer must be joking, testing him somehow, evaluating his reactions to outrageous proposals as part of some obscure legal training. Nathaniel began by discussing marriage, specifically his own marriage, with a frankness that was completely inappropriate given social conventions of the time. He explained that Catherine was a dutiful wife who fulfilled her social obligations admirably, but who had proven to be, in his carefully chosen words, deficient in certain physical aspects of the marital relationship. He went into details about their intimate life that made William profoundly uncomfortable, describing Catherine's apparent lack of passion, her passive acceptance of conjugal relations that Nathaniel found unsatisfying, despite producing 2 daughters. He theorized that this deficiency might be remedied through introduction of appropriate stimulus, that Catherine might prove more responsive to a different partner, someone younger, more physically appealing, someone who could awaken in her the passion that Nathaniel believed must exist beneath her cultivated propriety. William, realizing with growing horror where this conversation was leading, attempted to excuse himself, but Nathaniel ordered him to remain seated and listen, using the tone of absolute authority that characterized his courtroom presence and allowed no disobedience. The judge explained his proposal, speaking calmly, methodically, as if describing a legal proceeding rather than a violation of every social and moral code their society recognized. William would begin conducting intimate relations with Catherine under Nathaniel's observation. This was non-negotiable. The judge insisted on being present, on documenting what occurred, on studying Catherine's responses to determine whether his theory about her latent passion was correct. In exchange for William's participation, Nathaniel offered continued employment, eventual partnership in his legal practice, social introductions that would establish William's career, and most critically, protection from the consequences that would normally result from such an arrangement. Nathaniel made clear that refusal was not truly an option, that William's position was entirely dependent on the judge's patronage, that accusations of impropriety with Catherine could be easily manufactured and would destroy William's reputation and any hope of legal career regardless of truth. and that Nathaniel's influence extended throughout Virginia's legal and social establishment in ways that could make William's life very difficult if he didn't cooperate. William later testified that he spent a sleepless night considering his options, all of which seemed terrible in different ways, before concluding that he had no real choice. That Nathaniel held too much power over his circumstances, that refusal would likely result in ruin, while compliance might at least preserve some hope of future escape from the situation. What William couldn't have known, what no one except Nathaniel himself understood at that point, was that the judge had been planning this arrangement for months, possibly longer, that his hiring of William had been deliberate rather than coincidental, that he had selected his clerk based on physical appearance and personality traits that fit specific criteria Nathaniel had established for what he was attempting to create. The implementation of Nathaniel's arrangement began in May of 1839, following what the judge described in his journals as careful preparation of Catherine for her new duties. According to later testimony from enslaved servants who had witnessed enough to piece together some of what was occurring, Nathaniel began spending hours in private conversation with his wife, discussions that left Catherine visibly distressed, but apparently compliant with whatever was being proposed. One housemaid, a woman named Sarah, who had served Catherine since childhood, later stated that her mistress had wept in her presence and spoken of feeling trapped, of having no choice but to accept her husband's demands, of fearing what would happen if she refused. But Sarah also noted that Catherine never explicitly explained what those demands were, maintaining enough discretion that even the servants closest to her couldn't fully understand what was being required of her. The first encounter between Catherine and William, orchestrated by Nathaniel and occurring in the judge's private study while he observed and took notes, was described by William in his later testimony as the most traumatic experience of his young life up to that point, worse than anything he would experience until the situation's ultimate conclusion 14 years later. Catherine, according to William, was clearly terrified and unwilling, moving through the encounter like someone in a trance, responding to Nathaniel's instructions but showing no pleasure or desire, merely compliance born of some combination of fear and resignation that William couldn't fully comprehend. Nathaniel maintained a clinical detachment throughout, occasionally giving instructions about positioning or pace, taking extensive notes in a leather journal he would continue filling for the next 14 years, documenting every aspect of what he was observing with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized his legal work. This scene was repeated with increasing frequency over the following months, becoming a regular occurrence that Nathaniel scheduled into his calendar like court appointments, sometimes twice weekly, sometimes more often if his schedule allowed. The judge maintained detailed records of each encounter, noting Catherine's physical responses, making observations about which circumstances seemed to produce greater reaction, developing theories about female sexuality that he believed his experiment was confirming. He showed these notes to William occasionally, discussing them in an academic tone, as if they were engaged in scientific research, rather than the systematic violation of his own wife, and the coercion of a young man who had no real ability to refuse participation. Catherine became pregnant in late 1839, giving birth in July of 1840 to a son that Nathaniel named William Jr., making no secret within the household that the child was not biologically his, but was the result of his arranged couplings between his wife and his clerk. This transparency was, in Nathaniel's view, essential to his experiment. He wanted to observe how Catherine would respond to raising children conceived under these circumstances, whether maternal feeling would differ based on the children's paternity, whether the knowledge that her offspring came from imposed relations rather than conventional marriage would affect her behavior. The birth of William J. Orr might have been Catherine's opportunity to escape the arrangement. Scandal would have been devastating, but perhaps preferable to continuation of what Nathaniel was requiring. But whatever combination of fear, financial dependence, concern for her older daughter's futures, and perhaps genuine lack of other options kept Catherine trapped in the situation. She remained in the Mercer household, and the arrangement continued. Over the next 13 years, Catherine gave birth to 6 more children fathered by William Sterling, another son in 1842, daughters in 1844 and 1846, twin boys in 1848, and a final daughter in 1851. 7 children total, all conceived through encounters arranged and observed by Nathaniel, all documented in the judge's increasingly disturbing journals that filled shelf after shelf in his locked study. The children were raised as Mercers, given the family name, acknowledged by Nathaniel as his legal offspring despite everyone in the household knowing the biological truth, creating a situation so bizarre that servants who left the Mercer employment would tell stories that seemed too strange to be believed. Tales of a judge who forced his wife to bear children by his clerk while he watched and took notes like a natural philosopher studying animal breeding. Richmond society, to the extent it became aware that something unusual was occurring in the Mercer household, chose to look away. The judge was too powerful, too well-connected, too important to the functioning of Virginia's legal system for anyone to publicly question why all of Catherine's children after 1840 looked remarkably similar to William Sterling and nothing like Nathaniel Mercer. There were whispers, certainly, speculation about what might be occurring behind the mansion's closed doors. But whispers didn't translate into action. Not when the alternative was confronting a man who could destroy reputations with a single ruling from his bench. Who knew secrets about half of Richmond's prominent families from cases that had passed through his court? Who represented the kind of concentrated power that made people very careful about what accusations they voiced aloud? William Sterling, trapped in a situation that had begun when he was 19 and now extended into his 30s, had aged in ways that had little to do with years. Servants who knew him described a young man whose initial golden handsomeness had faded into something gaunt and hollow, whose eyes held a haunted quality that suggested years of being forced to participate in something he found abhorrent but couldn't escape. He had not married, unusual for a man of his age and social position, had formed no romantic attachments outside the Mercer household, had essentially sacrificed any possibility of normal life to Nathaniel's experiment. His legal career, which should have flourished under the judge's mentorship, had stagnated because Nathaniel kept him too busy with clerk duties and too psychologically damaged to function effectively in social situations where professional connections were formed. Catherine, meanwhile, had transformed from the accomplished young woman who had married Nathaniel into something more difficult to define. Not quite broken, but certainly bent under the weight of 14 years living in circumstances that violated everything she had been raised to believe about dignity, autonomy, and the role of women in Southern society. She fulfilled her duties as mother to 9 children, the 2 daughters from her marriage, and 7 offspring from Nathaniel's arrangement, with mechanical efficiency but little visible warmth, treating all the children with the same distant propriety, regardless of paternity. She maintained her social obligations, attending church and hosting dinners when required, performing the role of judge's wife with the skill of someone who had learned that survival sometimes required perfect performance of assigned parts, even when those parts made no internal sense. Nathaniel himself showed no signs of recognizing that his experiment was anything other than a valuable contribution to human knowledge. He continued documenting every aspect of the arrangement, had filled 37 leather-bound journals by 1853, and spoke occasionally to William about eventually publishing his findings, perhaps anonymously, as a contribution to medical and philosophical understanding of human sexuality and reproduction. That the subjects of his study were his own wife and his clerk, that the circumstances were non-consensual and exploitative, that he was documenting the destruction of 3 lives in pursuit of theories that had no basis in anything except his own obsessive need to control and observe. These considerations apparently never troubled his sleep or disturbed his confidence that he was engaged in important work. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely, hidden behind the Mercer mansion's walls and protected by Nathaniel's position and power, except that in March of 1853, William Sterling attempted suicide by laudanum overdose. He was discovered by Sarah, the housemaid, who called for Dr. Henry Matthews, the family physician who had delivered most of Catherine's children and who had maintained discreet silence about the unusual circumstances surrounding those births. Dr. Matthews managed to save William's life through aggressive treatment, but the incident could not be kept entirely quiet, and rumors that had previously circulated as whispers now began to circulate more openly as people questioned why a young lawyer in his 30s with apparently good prospects would attempt to end his own life. The Richmond Inquirer, the city's primary newspaper, began making oblique references to unusual circumstances in a prominent household, never naming the Mercers directly but providing enough detail that anyone familiar with the family could identify them. Virginia's legal establishment, finally confronted with a situation too public to ignore, initiated a private investigation that led to discovery of Nathaniel's journals, recovery of which required a search warrant that took considerable courage to issue given the judge's position. The journals, when examined by investigators and later by attorneys during proceedings that followed, proved to contain documentation of 14 years of what could only be described as systematic abuse enabled by Nathaniel's authority and orchestrated with chilling precision. The entries were clinical, detailed, making clear that Nathaniel had been fully aware of Catherine's unwillingness and William's coercion but had considered both irrelevant compared to his experimental objectives. He had documented his methods for compelling compliance from both participants, had noted strategies for preventing escape or rebellion, had recorded his observations of how long-term exposure to these circumstances affected his subjects' psychology and behavior, all written in the same precise legal language he used for court opinions, as if abuse became acceptable when documented with sufficient formality. The legal proceedings that followed were unprecedented and complicated by the fact that few laws existed that directly addressed what Nathaniel had done. He had not, technically, committed adultery, since he had not engaged in extramarital relations himself, but had merely arranged for others to do so. Catherine could not easily accuse him of forcing her into adultery, because such an accusation would require her to admit participation that would destroy her social standing, even if she was considered a victim, rather than a willing participant. William was technically an adult who had not, at least initially, been physically forced, but had been coerced through economic and social pressure in ways that law didn't clearly recognize as actionable. The solution, reached after months of private negotiations among Virginia's legal and social elite, was to handle the matter as quietly as possible, while still removing Nathaniel from his position and preventing him from continuing the arrangement. Nathaniel Mercer was allowed to resign his judgeship, citing health concerns, avoiding public trial that would have exposed details that no one wanted publicly discussed. Catherine was granted what amounted to a legal separation, though not formally termed as such, receiving financial support and custody of all 9 children, while Nathaniel was essentially exiled to a rural property in southwestern Virginia, where he could live out his remaining days away from polite society. William Sterling was given a sum of money and letters of introduction to attorneys in Kentucky, allowing him to relocate and attempt to rebuild a life far from Richmond and the memories of what he had experienced. The Mercer children, ranging in age from 13 to 24, were scattered among various relatives who agreed to take them in with the understanding that the circumstances of their conception would never be discussed openly. The journals, considered too disturbing to preserve but too important as evidence to destroy immediately, were sealed by court order and placed in archives where they remained locked away for 130 years. Their existence known only to a few legal historians and archivists who understood what they contained but had no desire to make their contents public. Nathaniel Mercer died in 1858 at his rural exile, reportedly still insisting to the end that his experiment had been valuable and that future generations would recognize his contributions to understanding human sexuality and reproduction, apparently never grasping that what he had documented was not scientific inquiry, but rather the detailed record of how a man with sufficient power and complete absence of conscience, could destroy lives while convincing himself he was pursuing knowledge. Catherine lived until 1879, never remarrying, never speaking publicly about the 14 years she had spent trapped in Nathaniel's arrangement, raising her children with what friends described as dutiful competence, but never apparent joy, as if some essential part of her had been permanently damaged by years of violation, made worse by being conducted with her husband's calm approval and meticulous documentation. She left no personal writings, no diary or letters that might have explained her thoughts or feelings during those years. Maintaining silence, that was perhaps the only form of dignity available to her given circumstances that Victorian society had no framework for understanding or addressing. William Sterling practiced law in Lexington, Kentucky for 20 years, never married, and died in 1873 at age 53. Reportedly from heart failure, though friends suggested that what had really failed was his will to continue living with memories of his years in the Mercer household, that his body had simply given up on existence, that had become more burden than gift. The 7 children William had fathered under such disturbing circumstances apparently never knew the full truth about their conception, or if they learned it, never spoke of it publicly, living their lives with the knowledge that their existence resulted from an arrangement that should never have been possible, but that their biological father's powerlessness and their mother's trapped circumstances had made inescapable. The discovery of Nathaniel's journals in 1983 by researchers studying Virginia's antebellum legal history brought renewed attention to a case that had been deliberately obscured and forgotten. The journals were eventually digitized and made available to scholars studying the dynamics of power, coercion, and abuse in historical contexts, providing disturbing insight into how authority can be used to create circumstances that violate every norm of decency while maintaining a veneer of legality and rationality. Nathaniel's meticulous documentation of his own systematic abuse, his apparent inability to recognize that what he was doing constituted harm rather than research, his conviction that coercion became acceptable when serving what he considered valuable experimental purposes. All this made the journals valuable as historical evidence while making them almost unbearable to read. Modern historians studying the Mercer case have noted how it illuminates the particular vulnerabilities created by antebellum Southern society's rigid hierarchies, where a man with sufficient social position could essentially imprison his wife and employee in circumstances they couldn't escape without destroying themselves, where law and social convention provided no recourse for victims whose oppression didn't fit recognized categories of crime, where power was so concentrated and unquestioned that a judge could document his own violations without apparent fear of consequences, because he understood that his position made him effectively immune to accountability. The case also raises troubling questions about consent and coercion, about whether participation in circumstances determined by massive power imbalances can ever be considered truly voluntary, about how economic dependence and social consequences can make people accept treatment that in any just world they would have every right to refuse. If this story revealed something you never knew about power and abuse in American history, leave a comment telling us what surprised you most. And if you want more untold stories of how authority was used to enable harm while hiding behind respectability, subscribe. These stories matter, not just as history, but as reminders that power concentrated without accountability creates circumstances where terrible things become possible, where abuse can be documented with clinical precision by perpetrators who never recognize themselves as such, where victims can be trapped for years in situations that destroy them, while the world looks away because confronting what's happening would be too uncomfortable, too complicated, too threatening to social stability. The Mercer case stands as testament to how Southern society's rigid hierarchies and refusal to acknowledge women's autonomy or recognize economic coercion as constraint-created environments where a man like Nathaniel could systematically abuse his wife and clerk for 14 years, while believing himself engaged in valuable research, where Catherine and William could be trapped in circumstances that violated them repeatedly while having no effective recourse because law and society provided no framework for recognizing their situation as wrong, let alone providing remedy. The 7 children born from this arrangement, the 37 journals documenting its progression, the lives destroyed and warped by Nathaniel's conviction that his experimental interests justified any imposition on others. These remain as evidence of what becomes possible when authority is absolute and accountability is absent, when power holders convince themselves that their purposes justify their methods and that documentation makes abuse into inquiry. The Marshall Street mansion still stands in Richmond, now subdivided into apartments, with no marker indicating the terrible secret it once contained. No acknowledgement that within those walls, a judge once conducted a 14-year experiment on human beings who had no real ability to refuse participation, who endured because refusing would have destroyed them as surely as compliance did, though perhaps more quickly and with less extensive documentation of their destruction. Some historians argue the Mercer case should be more widely known as an example of how abuse operates when enabled by power imbalances and social systems that prioritize authority over autonomy. But others contend that the case is too disturbing, too complicated by questions about complicity and coercion, too challenging to comfortable narratives about the past to be easily incorporated into popular understanding of history. What remains undeniable is that it happened, that the journals exist as proof, that Nathaniel Mercer used his position as judge to create circumstances that should never have been possible, and that Catherine and William and 7 children lived with consequences of those circumstances long after Nathaniel himself was dead, and his journals were sealed away in archives where they would wait 130 years before researchers would discover them and begin asking questions about what they revealed, not just about one family's nightmare, but about systems of power that make such nightmares possible and then bury them beneath silence and social convention, rather than confronting what they say about authority, unchecked in power, unaccountable.